Hey everybody, it's Wednesday morning. Time for another Ask Chuck Dixon, chapter 47. Let's get right to it. Kenny Todd, I have a question for the next Ask Chuck Dixon. I'm reading the rest of your Connor Hawk Green Arrow run. Thank you. I'm on the issue where Connor meets a time-displaced Hal Jordan Green Lantern. I was wondering how you felt about the premise. Also, what was involved with writing the Connor-Kyle crossover as it pertains to Ron Mars? Did you work out the story together or through your editor? Um, yeah, I was on wrote Connor Hawk Green Arrow for a while. I took the Green Arrow book on basically to help the editors out. I said I would stay for a year. I ended up staying for 3 because I really got into the character of Connor Hawk and his relationship with Eddie Fires and the death of Oliver Queen and all that stuff. And it was a good time. Now, the specifically the Hal Jordan thing was primarily set up to lay the groundwork for Kevin Smith's run on Green Arrow, which was going to follow mine. Um, and I had told them I wanted off the book at a certain point because my workload was getting too large even for me. And I thought, well, Green Arrow is a title I'd be willing to give up. Um, I wanted to stay on Birds of Prey, Robin, and Nightwing, but I felt I had to give up Green Arrow. And that's when the plans began to fall into place for Kevin Smith to take over the book. And so I spent the last few issues of my run setting up the bones of what he wanted to do with the title. So that was kind of an editorial decision based on Kevin Smith's desires for what the book would become. And, I'm a team player, played ball, and I felt I set the guy up really well. He wasn't terribly grateful about it, but I did it because I'm a pro. That's what I am. I am a professional comic book writer, whatever the hell that means. Now, as far as Green Lantern, Green Arrow crossovers, yeah, they were natural because the Green Lantern, Green Arrow, or Green Arrow, Green Lantern book of the 70s, which a lot of people were misty and nostalgic about, even though it sold like crap. I think Binky outsold the Denny O'Neil Neil Adams run on Green Lantern, Green Arrow. But I've said enough about that in the past. Um, yeah, so we did a few crossovers with other, you know, Justice League members. The replacement squad, Kyle Rayner and Wally West, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and I got to work with Ron. And generally, I think Ron was living in upstate New York. I'm not sure where Ron was living at the time. I think he was in Woodstock, or maybe he's in Woodstock now. I can't remember. But he lived close enough he could come into the city just like I did. So on each occasion, and we did this like 2 or 3 times, and on each occasion where we had Green Lantern, Green Arrow meet up, um, he would come into the city and we would meet with the editors. And generally, it only took, the morning, a morning session, and we would work out a general plot line, who the bad guy was, who the threat was, and all that stuff. And I think the first one, I can't remember. I think the first one he may have driven, the second one I may have driven. But I got a lot of fond memories of one of them because we returned to Desolation, the town from Green Lantern, Green Arrow, from the Denny and Neil Adams run. Town of Desolation, which was, driven into servitude by some corporate masters who were, polluting the water and the air and everything else. And my return to Desolation showed that it was now the lawsuit capital of the world. Uh, because the citizens, lawyered up and sued the corporations for everything they could possibly get. So you had a town of millionaires. So where once you had this sort of bohunk, rural, nowhere town, now it was Rodeo Drive. People with lots of spare cash to spend. Um, I liked working with Ron. He was flexible. I was flexible. My only problem is that Ron tends to write much closer to deadline than I do, with dangerously close to deadline, like pencilers waiting for script pages close to deadline, which is something I cannot tolerate. And during the time of these crossovers, I was generally 6 months to even a year ahead on scripts. I was way past deadline. Nobody was waiting on scripts for me. I could have kept a small army of artists busy with all the scripts that DC had in hand from me. And so on the first crossover, there was a degree of frustration because our working styles differed, and I would have to wait for um, for Ron's scripts to complete my next issue. And so with the next crossover, I insisted that it be laid out more exactly so that I could write my 2 issues of the crossover, um, and not have to wait for him, so that we would know exactly what went on in each issue. And so basically, I wrote my 2 issues and he played catch up. Uh, but he works his way, I work mine. I just don't like, I'm the kid who first day of Christmas vacation did his homework, so I didn't have to think about that holiday assignment over the holidays. Why did teachers do that? The sadistic thing they used to do. Here, have fun at Christmas and write this 200-word essay. Bring it back in January. Thanks, teach. Okay, Kibabip, I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. In the past, there have been many examples of young people in startups getting jobs working for the bigger companies. Of note, Jim Shooter at 13, Jerry Conway at 16, Len Wein at 20, Marv Wolfman at 22, and so forth. Could such things happen today? Yeah, I guess anything could happen, but the problem is it's just not as easy to get in. Those guys you mentioned basically approached the companies when, they needed talent. They needed warm bodies. It's like in the 1980s. In the 1980s, if you had a pulse, you could get a job in comics because the sales were exploding, the number of companies were exploding, everybody needed inventory. And so, I broke in the 80s because they needed writers. They needed writers, they needed artists. So, a lot of probably your favorite people right now broke in the 80s because they were needed in the 90s as well. Uh, the doors were open. Because when I was a kid, um, all of the guys who creating the comics I was writing had been in the business, you know, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years at that point. There wasn't a lot of new talent showing up. I remember that's why there was so much excitement about Jim Steranko. He was like the first new artist to come along in literally decades. Uh, so yeah, it was easy for kids. And plus, some of the people you're mentioning there would simply go to the offices and hang out, or they would intern or whatever, you know. So you could go up there and pester them and hope that, some acorns fell off the tree that you could pick up, and get writing assignments. And of course, those guys were young, but they proved themselves. I mean, Jim Shooter certainly, he was just a young punk kid, but he knew how to write a comic book story. So, he earned his place. It wasn't just that they got lucky because, you can get lucky, but what do you do with that luck? If someone gives you a break and you don't do anything with it, you've wasted that break. I like to think that, every editor that ever gave me a break, I paid them back by giving them, you know, quality material delivered on time. They never had to stay awake at night waiting for my work. Um, So yeah, I guess, if you were a young kid, you could get in today, but it might be better off if you were a young kid that wrote a hit TV series or wrote a novel that the New York Times, you know, reviewers thought was good. Then you can slum in comics. But yeah, it was a different time back then. Myself, I didn't break into full-time writing of comics till I was 32. And looking back, I'm glad of it. I got to experience some life, some highs and lows, some emotional catharsis before I got into writing full time. So I had something to draw on from my own life. It's like Larry Hama said: don't write about human relationships until you've had one. So I had a few, and I think it definitely made me a better writer than if I had started out from high school and been a know nothing geek and just stayed a know nothing geek into my middle age, if that makes any sense at all. Well, I rambled all over the place on that one. Uh, I'll try to stay more specific. Chuck, a little follow up on the Bane question. You said his venom is like mainlining testosterone. So it would make it like anabolic steroids. So does Bane therefore suffer from the same side effects, such as the body's natural testosterone production center, the cojones, shutting down due to the exogenous testosterone injections? Is it even more this diminutive testicle effect from the venom being stronger? But if it's like artificial testosterone, he must have very shrunken cojones too. His cojones would have completely retired to Florida. I think it's safe to say that Bane's cojones are the size of raisins because the more testosterone you take, the less functional your testicles become. Not to get too personal with everybody, but anytime you take a drug to replace the function of a gland or an organ, that organ shrinks into insignificance. Myself, I take thyroid medication. Consequently, my thyroid does nothing because it doesn't feel it needs to because the medication replaces that function. And it's the same with any other part of your body. So yeah, he's going to suffer the side effects of taking this stuff. He's not always going to be, um, you know, there's a price to be paid. Let's put it that way. And there's all kinds of health risks if we're going to get realistic. High blood pressure, uh, the actual chemistry of your blood changes. You produce too many red blood cells. Red blood cells. Your blood thickens. Yeah, I've done some reading on this. So there's all kinds of negative health benefits to using human growth hormones, steroids, and lots of testosterone. But what does Bane care? He's just out there to kick ass. And of course, we have done stories, or I did one story anyway, where we showed Bane in prison, I think post Legacy. And of course, the venom was taken away from him. And he just became, a big pile of goo, just a big doughy guy because, he didn't have that. And at this point, his metabolism is ruined. He actually needs that venom, probably needs the venom at this point to stay alive, even a minimum dose to regulate his heart, circulation, lungs. Yeah, that's the science of Bane right there, my friends. You learned something today, didn't you? Uh, Comics Gatekeeper, how do you feel about the trend of stories and events leading directly to the next event without proper conclusion? For example, Under the Red Hood ended with a lead in to Bloodhaven exploding rather than an ending. Yeah, you gotta have a story end. Even in a periodical publication like a comic book, you've got to have a story end. Because then the reader feels cheated. I mean, when we started quote unquote writing for the trade, um, you know, it changed the way that comics were written. A lot of people took it as an excuse to pad, and then other people like myself looked at it as like a novel length story. That needed a satisfying, cathartic conclusion to it. But with the big company events that go on for a year or more now, they don't really seem to know how to pace these things out to give you a satisfying story in a 6-issue chunk, which basically, let's face it, that's what a trade is. It's 6 issues of a comic book. So, I like to think that in Nightfall we did that. We gave you 6-issue chunks of story where things are resolved. And of course, it's a periodical, it's an ongoing, it's a soap opera. So there are dangling story threads left to continue the saga, but you want your main story elements wrapped up. There's nothing wrong with, open-ended stories that might lead to other stories. Plenty of movies end with the idea that there's more story to tell, but they've told you the story they meant to tell you, but with the implications that this is all part of a larger universe, a larger fictional world. Um, so that while the conclusions are satisfying, they leave questions unanswered and make you wonder, well, what happens next? But that's okay because you've been given that ending that you were looking for, that twist, that surprise, that catharsis, the resolution of the main storyline, and but leaving you with the sense that there is more to tell. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you've got to end that main storyline. You've got to give the reader what they're looking for in the story, not just make it a trailer for the next project, if you get what I'm talking about. And Empire Strikes Back is an excellent example. You watch that movie, and boy, it asks a lot of questions that aren't answered at the end of the film. But you can't say you didn't see a movie. You can't say you weren't told a story, because you were. It's for my money, the best Star Wars film ever made. It's, they never equaled it, certainly never topped it. Um, but it is a hell of a movie going experience, but leaves so many things unanswered that, and so many opportunities for Lucas to further disappoint us. Levi Sweeney, question for the podcast. What makes a story original? It's hard to say, because, you take in a lot of input into your mind, your own life experiences, things you read, things you hear, people you meet, and you put that all together. And when you write that story that you're burning to tell, who knows what the source of it was, what the true source of it was, where those things came from. And of course, as a writer, you want to avoid, number one, repeating yourself, and number two, unconsciously copying another story. When I was at community college, I have quote unquote some college. I went to community college. Basically, I enrolled because it kept me on my dad's insurance, and I needed my wisdom teeth out. So the tuition for community college was cheaper than than the dentist would have been. The dental surgery would have been without the insurance. But I went to a few classes, and one of them was creative writing, and we were told to write a short story, and I wrote a short story about a guy in the 1880s in Alaska who was hunting for a bear that killed his friends, and ultimately he finds out it wasn't a grizzly, it was a polar bear. So he has to go further north to stalk this critter. And I wrote it, and I was really happy with it. I thought it was really cool. And, I hadn't written anything that long. It was maybe a 30, 40-page story. I'd never written anything that long before. I was a, punk kid right out of high school. And it wasn't until the teacher pointed out that I'd ripped off Moby Dick that I realized I've ripped off Moby Dick, which I did. So from that point on, I was always very conscious of, where's this story coming from? Is it coming from, the tangled web within my own head, or did I hear it somewhere and I'm unconsciously repeating it? So what is original? It's hard to determine when you're writing, is the short answer. The originality is kind of in the eye of the beholder. I mean, as I get older, I see stuff on TV and in movies. Hell, I've seen this before. Hell, I saw this story with Jimmy Cagney, but now it's got, flavor of the month, hot actor in it. It's the same damn thing. It's the same damn situation. It's the same story, but it's fresh to this audience because they never saw the Jimmy Cagney movie. And how do I know that I'm thinking, hey, this Jimmy Cagney story was original, and it might have been, a play in the 1800s. I have no idea, because each generation builds on its own experiences. And the thing is, we're exposed to so much story these days. Everywhere you turn, we see narrative. It's hard to separate what you've taken in from what you're putting out. I guess originality is up to the reader. It's up to history to decide whether something is literature, or whether it was original, or whether it was just derivative crap. So I don't worry about those things when I write. It's up to other people to decide. It's like I've said before on themes and things like that. I don't think about that stuff when I write. That's up to the reader to discern from the work itself. Travis L.D. Murphy says, while the American comic scene has declined over recent history, the Japanese comics or manga market continues to grow stronger with each passing year. Why do you think that is? Also, why do you believe the American comic industry, what do you believe the American comic industry ought to learn from Japan's? Speaking of manga, in an earlier Ask Chuck Dixon episode, you mentioned your admiration for Vinland Saga. Are there any other manga series that you've enjoyed? Well, one of the things about manga that's different than American comics is there's no specialization. let's face it, the majority of American comics are superhero comics. And the next closest genre is horror, and there's really nothing else after that. You've got superhero and scary stories, and you don't have anything else. So if you don't like superheroes, which most people don't, despite the success of the movies, most people don't care for superhero uh, comics, and you don't like horror comics, you got nowhere to go. Japan, where they still listen to their audience, they still care about sales, they still care about earnings, don't care about politics in their comics. They have comics about everything. You know, they have comics about golf. They have comics about baseball. They have comics about soccer. They have comics about cooking, about chefs. Comics about medicine. When's anybody in America ever done a comic book about a doctor? You know, I think EC Comics had an MD comic for a while that was about doctors. But when's the last time? You know, forever. On the same subject, one of my favorites is, and I'm going to murder this name, it's Tsukichi Senpai, and it's a comic book about fishing. It's a manga about fishing, and it's been turned into an anime, obviously, from this image. And it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I ran into it in the 70s, right near DC Comics was and probably is the Kinokuniya, a Japanese bookstore. And anytime I went to New York to visit publishers, I would visit this store because it was the only place I knew where you could find manga. You know, the only other place is if you knew someone who was going to Hawaii. And very rarely I would, you know, have a family member or friend and they were going to go to Hawaii. I said, bring me back some Japanese manga. They would bring back these amazing telephone book sized comics. Um, that was the only place I knew to get them until I went to Kinokuniya. Now, Tsukichi Senpai is about fishing. It's primarily about this kid, but he's got all these different friends and associates who fish, and they, you know, surf cast and they fly fish. I know nothing about fishing, but it's the comic was drawn in this style that was so detailed. A lot of manga isn't terribly detailed. It was incredibly detailed. The attention to the natural surroundings, because it was all about nature, um, just amazing. And it had a style that was more akin to a European inking style than a lot of manga is. Um, and the storytelling was spectacular. I reread one. Well, I couldn't reread it. They've never been translated into English. But I looked at one recently for this video, and it's like a 220 page story, and 107 of those pages is this kid has a fish on the line in a river, and we don't see the fish for 127 pages. I mean, he's basically playing this fish for 127 pages while his, you know, friends and associates look on with encouragement. And trust me, it's entertaining as hell. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's so, you know, mostly visually told, and you fully understand what's involved with reeling in this monster fish. And then the next like 100 pages are actually wrestling. Once this fish breaks water, and it's huge, um, you know, it's wrestling with this fish. So yeah, it's an amazing comic if you ever get to see it. I have some editions from Portugal. It's the closest I could get to English. And then, of course, I have some original mangas that I picked up at Kinokuniya. Another favorite, obviously, is Astro Boy. Osamu Tezuka was, you know, the Jack Kirby of manga and created so many indelible characters, Astro Boy being, you know, his signature creation, and simply brilliant. I had a full set of these in Japan, and then, you know, finally Dark Horse reprinted. They printed English editions, and I have to thank Jim Engel, my cartoonist buddy from Chicago, for letting me know that manga editions were available of Astro Boy, because I think I eventually bought them through the mail through some dealer that he hooked me up with. Another favorite is Gogol 13. Duke Togo, hired hitman, killer at large. Just badass stories. I mean, there's hundreds of these manga. This is another one I discovered at Kinokuniya and would buy. And there have been some American editions, but I really dig it. I dig the movies too. There's some really excellent animes based on this series. Black Lagoon is another one, a more recent shoot 'em up gunplay manga that I really enjoy. I like the style of it. It's real kinetic and crazy, and I dig it the most. And most recently, I Am a Hero. It's a zombie epic about this kid. He's like he's like the only armed citizen in Japan because he's a skeet shooter. He's an amateur skeet shooter, so he's allowed to own a shotgun. And the Japanese version of a zombie story gets super creepy and super weird. It's different than American Zombie, but that's a manga. Probably this and Vinland Saga are the only current manga that I follow. There's so much manga between Japan and Korea. Nobody could follow all of it, and a lot of it simply doesn't appeal to me. It's not written for me. I am not the audience for it. But yeah, I've dug manga for a very long time, and continue to do so. Charles Santino. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the worst art you got on a job you scripted, with 10 being the worst? No names, of course. No, I will not. I will not name anybody. But when I was at DC in the 90s, I was kind of the go-to guy. When there was a problem with deadlines or whatever, I was the guy that, hey, could you do this? Could you fill in here? And a lot of times I was asked to break in new talent, and sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't. And particularly in the early '90s, there were some not ready for prime time and some never ready for prime time artists showing up. And like I said earlier, if you had a pulse, you could get a job in comics. So these wannabes showed up who really weren't ready and never would be. On a scale of 1 to 10, probably the worst I've ever had is a 5. If we're going best to worst, um, you know, some people just simply didn't understand the medium, and sometimes even you would find a good artist. The guy was a good artist, but he was a lousy storyteller, and that hurt the most. I'd rather have a good storyteller whose art isn't up to par than someone who can't get the story across. The worst one was I did an issue of a comic. I won't name names. Did an issue of a comic that featured an alien character who had been previously established in DC, and the artist didn't understand, and he spoke English as a first language, so there was no excuse. The artist didn't understand that every time I mentioned the alien in the story, it was the same alien. I mean, there were model sheets for this alien, style guides for this alien, but every time he showed up, it was a different alien. So readers must have been as confused as hell, because there was absolutely, literally no continuity to the story, because every time they saw the bad guy character, he looked completely different. And of course, the editors didn't pay any attention. And this was during the time when DC had shifted to editors who were mostly indifferent about their job. So the editors didn't notice, and so it was never sent back to me for a rewrite, so I could write in a reason why the alien looked different and let the reader know this is the same alien you saw 3 pages ago. It looked like an invasion from another world, where none of the invaders ever showed up in the same place at the same time. But another story, which I think I've told in one of these before, was an editor told me, you that guy who did that series at Image, and he's the hottest thing on, whatever, Wizard Magazine put him in the hot 10 guy to watch. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know the artist. What did you get him for this issue? And he goes, no, I got his brother. And the guy was serious. And the brother couldn't really draw either. So Michael A. Barron, now tell us about Robert McKee's story. Robert McKee's story structure course. Again, 90s DC, Denny O'Neil and Archie Goodwin. Both were my editors at DC, senior editors, group editors, whatever, comic book legends, without a doubt. They had taken the Robert McKee story structure course, and they thought that all of the writers at DC should take it. mostly because we would have a shared language. And it's true, Robert McKee articulated things about writing that most writers never really thought about in their mind in words. He took it from the intuitive to more of a, not a science, but the more technical aspects, the more craft aspects of writing he would talk about. And Denny and Archie thought if everyone took the course, everybody would be on the same page and everybody would understand what each other were talking about. That Robert McKee gave us a language in which to talk about writing. And Denny was a big proponent of it. I asked Archie what his opinion was, and he said that he, McKee will teach you to write when you don't feel like writing. And I thought, well, that's a valuable skill to have for a writer, because there's mornings you wake up and you just don't feel like doing it. You know, feel like doing anything else. Hell, I'll wash the windows. I'll walk the dog. I'll mow the lawn. Don't make me write. So, the other positive aspect for me is that DC was paying for a weekend in New York, and they put me up at a nice hotel and covered all my meals. And, I got to hang out in New York. And I thought, hey, I'm going to go to the movies and go do this and go do that. Well, little did I know that the McKee course was boot camp. It was 3 days, and I mean days. I mean, you woke up in the morning and dragged yourself into the seminar hall. And in the evening, you dragged yourself out to your hotel room, ordered room service, and went to sleep. And this guy went, 8 to 12 hours of talking about writing. Now, this isn't Robert McKee. I can never resist. This is Brian Cox, who played Robert McKee in the movie adaptation, which if you ever get a chance to see, it's a terrific movie about writing. And Brian Cox was absolutely perfectly cast as Robert McKee. Yes, the original Hannibal Lecter was the guy to play Robert McKee because he's a dilettante. Is that a word to use? Now, here's Bob McKee himself. And he would command that stage. And he'd be literally on a stage. I saw him at Hunter College in an auditorium with about 500 people. I mean, standing room only. And there were even some Hollywood professionals in the crowd. Griffin Dunn was in the audience. And apparently John Cleese had taken the course the weekend before in London. And that's what Robert McKee did. He traveled around the world, New York, LA, Washington, D.C., London, I don't know where else. And he would give these seminars. This was his job. Now, what qualified him for this? He could talk about story. It wasn't really his background because he'd written some television. He'd written some episodes of Quincy, which to my mind doesn't recommend you to anybody to talk about writing. But he had theories about story structure, and he was worth listening to. And that's all you did was you listened to him. And you better not ask any questions. When I was there, 3 people asked questions, and he eviscerated all 3 of them. I could never understand why, after he tore the first one to shreds, 2 more people asked questions. Somebody asked about like Ghostbusters 2, and he just, carpet bombed them from the stage, just ripped them a new one, shot their sails to tatters. And afterwards, we broke for lunch. He basically ripped this person apart and then, oh, let's break for lunch. And so we break for lunch, and when we come back, someone had written a note and put it on the podium telling him that he should apologize for being so rude. And of course, that person was unidentified, but he tore into them. He devastated this anonymous person who wrote the note for another 15, 20 minutes. But what did I get out of it? Was it worth going? Were Denny and Archie right? Yes, they were. Because he articulated, he put into words what writers intuit. And I didn't agree with everything he said. And of course, I wasn't going to get up and say that. But he talked about 3-act structure and 4-act structure. And I never get that. It's like mathematics to me. I mean, that's why I write, because I'm scared of math. That's why my job is making stuff up, because I don't want to deal with real stuff like, numbers. So he would talk about that structure. And I didn't really get it. But other stuff he said I did get. Sort of like opened up my mind. One of the things he said, which should be obvious to anybody, but it wasn't to me, because I had no professional training to write. I just wrote. one of the things he said was that the most important thing about a character is what they want. And that literally blew my mind. I never had my mind blown before, but that blew because I began to get like this. I've never done drugs. What I imagine an acid flashback must be like, where as he says that, and I'm digesting it, my mind is racing. It's like, yeah, that Superman wants to belong to the human race. Batman wants to, you know, fulfill his promise to his parents to seek justice. Darth Vader wants his son to come into the family business. You know, all of these, that's what drives these characters forward, what they want, what they desire. And his idea was is that if you can put that across, that desire, that drive towards some sort of a goal, then your characters will, automatically have fully realized personalities and, to be clear to the audience what their motives are. And if maybe as I say this, if you've never thought about this before, you're doing the same thing I was doing. It's like, wow, you know, this solves a lot of problems for me. And that was one of the main things I got out of it. The other thing was is mostly as I said, he articulated or confirmed things I was already intuiting, but didn't even realize I was doing. The final day of the seminar, he showed Casablanca. And when I say showed it to us, he showed it to us. It took like 8 hours because he kept stopping it and talking about each scene. And the main thing I took away from that was is that the screenwriters and Michael Curtiz, the director, in every instance in that movie, made sure that every scene not only drove the story forward, but served other purposes. Um, Creating depth for the characters, or putting across remorse, or cranking up suspense, or whatever. Every scene served two or more purposes. And the other beautiful thing about Casablanca, it's one of those rare films where you have a great ensemble cast and everybody gets a moment. Everybody gets at least one moment in that film that makes them a memorable character. And you know that, and that was the end. I left the place freaking exhausted. I mean, it was boot camp, like I said, for writers, and a lot was discussed. Well, not discussed. You sat there and listened, and he told some great anecdotes, some terrific stories. I mean, just really howlingly funny stories about Hollywood. And he also, tore apart a lot of movies I loved, and then talked about movies that I'd never seen, and then talked about movies that I did like. And the thing about it was he was very egalitarian in his criticism. I mean, he talked about why Rocky is a great film. He wasn't talking about The Grand Illusion, or some obscure you know Taiwanese film nobody's ever seen. He talked about movies that we knew, and why they worked and why they didn't. He's particularly unkind to the Mel Gibson, I think Sissy Spacek film The River. He just man, oh man, he couldn't say enough bad things about that movie. He kept using it as a negative example. I think it was the most recent bad movie he had seen, and he just tore it apart. He also had no use for the Coen brothers, which I didn't quite understand. But again, I didn't raise my hand and ask why. Neil Matthews, can I ask for a future episode the outlay of the story to the sequel to A Man Called Frank and the excellent artwork by the great Russ Heath? Russ Heath. If you don't know who Russ Heath is, well, go watch something else. Russ Heath was my favorite comic book artist. I got to admit, favorite comic book artist, hands down, because he was so expert at the two genres in comics I love the most, which is Western and war. And Russ was the consummate professional, consummate, grumpy old comic book guy. And I got to know Russ quite well. Spent entire days with him, and I mean all day long. It's just, we were compadres for quite a while when he visited Florida. And basically, I was the guy driving him around, making sure he got fed. And we just spent all day talking, and like the McKee course, mostly listening. mostly listening, because Russ would go off on stories. Ostensibly, he wanted to talk to me about writing a biography. And he wanted to talk about his life in comics. I think he talked about comics for about 5 minutes, and the rest of the time talked about his adventures, and he had a lot of them. So yeah, if you don't know Russ Heath's work, it's great stuff. The guy was the full package. Dramatic storytelling, terrific page layouts, and he made his mark all over the place as the consummate professional, super perfectionist. Everything. I loved it because he just researched the hell out of everything. There is nothing anachronistic in this panel. Every weapon, piece of uniform and equipment is what would have been used in that period because he was a stickler. Everywhere he went, if there was any kind of museum or a relic, he told me when I spent some time with him that he had just come back from France where he had photographed a tiger tank that was out in the field. And he took like a bajillion photographs of this thing. But when I was a kid, Heath was he would do covers like this one. I could just stare at forever. Um, just that's amazing stuff. And like I said, he freak for detail and the research and all the rest of it. And when I talked to him, he like tried to say that he wasn't. He said that I'm not like you guys in comics now. You guys think about comics all the time. You live, eat, and breathe it. He goes, back in my day, we worked on the comics, and then we 5 o'clock we put our pens and pencils down, and we went home and or we went out and got a drink, and we didn't think about comics ever again. And when he told me that, I said, Russ, that's a lot of bullshit because look at the stuff you did. Look, and I had a whole rack of his 50s Atlas comics at hand. And I was holding them up. I said, you didn't put the pen down at 5 o'clock on this one. You didn't phone this one in. You cared. They weren't paying you enough to do this kind of work. This level of quality, this level of attention. The hours you must have spent on each page of this story or on this cover. And he said, yeah, I put a lot more into the work than they were paying me for. So he had to admit it. And I'm glad I made him admit it because, he was a nerd and a geek just like the rest of us. Now, he not only did war and Western, excuse me for the Russ Heath history, but you asked me about Russ, so I'm going to tell you about Russ. He worked on Little Annie Fanny for Playboy, which led to a 6-month stay at the Playboy Mansion in Chicago, which apparently Hef didn't know about. Russ just sort of moved in, took up residence until somebody finally said, who the hell are you? And why are you here all the time? And they kicked him out. And Russ told me a lot of stories that I will not repeat and swore to him I would never repeat about his experiences working for Playboy. You use your own imagination, kids. He also, this is Russ himself, he worked quite a bit at National Lampoon and did some awesome stuff for them, a whole bunch of comic book parodies, my favorite of which is Cowgirls at War. Now, I got to work with Russ quite a bit at both DC and Marvel. I let my editors know that anytime they wanted to assign Russ to anything that I was working on, I would be over the moon. And so, we got to work on the Punisher and the Nom and things like that. And actually, ultimately, I wrote what was sadly his last Haunted Tank story for a Sergeant Rock special. And so when it came time to do a sequel to A Man Called Frank, uh, this was background on this was uh, I I can't remember if it was my idea or Don Daly's idea, or we both came up at the same time to do a Western version of the Punisher, basically an Elseworlds, where Frank Castle is a vigilante gunfighter in the Old West. And Don Daly said, I love the idea. I love it. Go talk to Tom DeFalco. And he immediately sent me upstairs to talk to Tom. So I go knock on Tom's door. And Tom, can I talk to you for a minute? And he's like, yeah, okay. I said, Don and I have this idea to do The Punisher as a Western, just a one shot. And Tom said what he always said, which was go down to marketing. If they say they can sell that, we'll do it. So I would go down to marketing. Lou Bank was head of marketing at the time. And I explained the story to Lou, and Lou says, yeah, I can sell that. Go back up to Tom. Lou says he can sell it. Tom says, tell Don, full speed ahead. Went down to the offices, and we ran through all of our possibles. Don immediately started making phone calls. Russ Heath was busy at the time. John Severin was busy at the time. But John Buscema, never too busy. Never too busy for a Western. And John jumped in, and, it was, I'm in hog heaven. I'm getting to write a Punisher Western. And, it was violent and nasty, and I can't remember the plot line, but it ends up in Mexican bandits and fights along the border and blah 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 blah, and it was a blast to work on. It sold well, it did very well, and so a sequel was planned, and this time we had more time, so we decided we would do it as an arc in Punisher Warzone, a 5-issue arc with Frank Castle once again returning to the Old West. And this time, because we had some ability to pre-plan it, we asked Russ Heath if he would work on it. And he had done an arc on Punisher Warzone with me previously. And so, yeah, he was like, all for it. Let's do it. And a number of pages were produced. And the basic plot line was that it's following the raid on Columbus, New Mexico, I believe it was, by the Pancho Villa band. Pancho Villa and his, outlaw band of revolutionaries in real life crossed the border and raided an American town for money and arms and food, and then crossed back over the border, which caused the United States to become outraged, and they sent an expedition south of the border after Villa, which in this panel Frank Castle is finding out for the first time. And of course, Frank Castle is going to want to be in on this because there's a reward for Pancho Villa, and Castle is going to want to go down and hunt the guy down, go down into Mexico. And his biggest challenge is to get ahead of Blackjack Pershing's American expedition, cavalry expedition, down into Mexico to hunt for bandits. And the big hook on the story for me, and the reason why it's sad that we didn't get to complete it, is that one of the officers that went down with Pershing to Mexico was a young lieutenant named George Patton. And George Patton, in real life in Mexico, pretty much was the Punisher. Patton would borrow Pershing's touring car at night and go hunting for bandits. And he would show up at haciendas where he knew bandits were hanging out and challenge them to gunfights, which he would then win. And he would return to camp the following morning with dead banditos tied across the hood of the touring car. This is for real. This really happened. And I thought, boy, what would it be like if, Blood and Guts Patton met up with Frank Castle? Well, both are rivals hunting down Pancho Villa's band. So, I mean, yeah, if you're a fan of any of this kind of stuff, you're probably starting to well up with tears now because we never got to do it. We never got to complete it. Most of the first issue was penciled and inked, and that's about it. You can go to chuckdixon.net and see most of the pages in some form of completion there. I was fortunate enough to get Xeroxes of what had been completed before it was canned. And, ultimately what happened was Don Daly was fired. And in any kind of entertainment business, what happens when a person is fired is the person who takes over their job decides that everything they were doing was crap and cancels everything. And Don had a lot of inventory in his drawers, including an entire Punisher and the Savage Land graphic novel I had done, and countless backup stories. And there's lots and lots of unpublished Punisher work that I wrote, and I'm sure that others wrote, that never saw the light of day. And sadly, the Man Called Frank sequel was one of them. So there you go. There's the history of the comic that will never be. Now, favorite authors. I continue the thing with favorite authors. Patricia Highsmith. Patricia Highsmith wrote in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and she wrote mostly thrillers. And her thrillers were different than anyone else's because she generally wrote them not, sometimes from the point of view of the criminal, sometimes third person limited. In other words, we were limited to the view of what that lead character can see and experience. And just, you know, and she wrote different than just about anybody who wrote crime stuff. And she wrote about people that were either criminals themselves, sociopathic criminals themselves. And in real life, from everything I've read, she was a bit of a sociopath herself. So she understood what she was writing about. Or she would write about people who were, you know, victims of fate, people who were wrongly accused of crime. They're wrongly accused of a crime, and the noose just keeps getting tighter and tighter as the story progresses. Or people, there's a terrific novel called The Bungler, and it's about a guy. A guy just can't get out of his own way. Everything he does makes his life worse. She's most famous for her Ripley novels. Tom Ripley, who is a psychopath who makes his way through the world. He's a charming guy, charming, good-looking guy who makes his way through mostly the world of Europe. He's an expatriate American, and he, you know, through scheming and murder and con games and impersonating, you know, people, he basically makes himself this weird underground living through a series of novels, eventually becoming somewhat of a hero in his own mind, in which he opposes other criminals. There's a great one where he takes on the mafia and comes out the winner, and some of them are about art thievery, and you know, been made into any number of movies. And of course, Patricia Highsmith was grist for a lot of movies. The French film Cry the Owl, another French film Purple Noon that features Alain Delon as Tom Ripley. Two Faces of January is a recent one, Viggo Mortensen. I think it's on Netflix. You can find it. And of course, her most famous creation, Strangers on a Train, classic Hitchcock film. And this is one that combines Highsmith's two favorite themes, which is, you know, the sociopathic user, and the unintended victim. In this movie, if you've never seen it, Robert Walker plays Bruno, a character who wants his dad dead so that he can inherit all the money and not have his parents looking over his shoulder all the time. And Farley Granger is a professional tennis player with a troublesome ex-wife. Bruno offers to knock off the tennis pro's ex-wife to make his life easier. In exchange, he expects Farley Granger to knock off his dad. Perfect crime, crisscross, as Bruno says. They'll commit each other's murders, and because they have no association with the victims, would never be suspect. And so you see here it combines the sociopathic user with Farley Granger, who is a guy getting in way over his head, who does not mean to become a criminal but ends up wrongly accused of murder. Yeah, Highsmith's stuff is it's readily available everywhere. She stays in print. It's a testament to the quality of her work that her work is constantly in print, always interesting, and always a different take on the crime genre, a take entirely her own. So that's it for me for this week. If you liked it, say you liked it. If you didn't like it, keep it to yourself. But hit that like button because it helps YouTube direct other people who might be interested in the same kind of material to these videos. It increases the audience, increases the community, as it were, for Ask Chuck Dixon, and it makes it possible for me to keep doing these because I really want to keep doing them, but I really need the audience to grow. So give me a like, give me a thumbs up, and share it. Sharing as well is a good thing. Let other, geeks and geekettes know that there's someone out here willing to answer their questions in depth about comic book writing, the comic book business, and just creative stuff in general. I'm just here every week, friends, spilling my guts for you. Okay, see you next week. See you down the road.